Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to go ahead and start things up a little bit here, just for the sake of time. But feel free to continue to get food, mill about as you need. There's water fountains down the hall as well. But thank you for coming to this session of Conversation in Conflict Studies series hosted by Park. This is our second one for the semester, and we have a significantly larger crowd and a nicer room, so it's worked out very well. I'd like to start us off by respectfully acknowledging the Onondaga Nation, firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous people on whose ancestral lands Syracuse University now stands. My name is Logan Carnicelli. I am a graduate assistant here at the Program for the Advancement of Research on Conflict and Collaboration, also known as PARC. And it's my pleasure to be hosting the series this semester. Today we're here with Mark Lichtenstein. Mark is a PARC faculty associate, the Executive Operating Officer, Chief Sustainability Officer, and an Environmental Studies Adjunct Professor at the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry, ESF. He is a member of the National Roster of Environmental Conflict Resolution Professionals, has a Master of Arts in Public Administration, and a Graduate Certificate of Advanced Study in Conflict Resolution, both from the Maxwell School, and graduate training in environmental science, as well as a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Studies from ESF. Mark has been engaged with sustainability and regenerative community engagements throughout the Caribbean, Central, and South America, in addition to the U.S. He is involved with post-disaster issues, testifying to U.S. Congress in 2017 about hurricane responses in Puerto Rico. Mark was a facilitator of that Vieques Sustainability Task Force, established by U.S. President Barack Obama in a program of the White House Task Force on Puerto Rico. He was a member of the New York State Stands with Puerto Rico initiative, is Vice President for Island Green Living Association in the U.S. Virgin Islands, Treasurer for Vieques Love, and an advisor to Green VI, a program in the British Virgin Islands. He also co-founded and facilitated the Puerto Rico and U.S. Virgin Islands Recycling Partnerships. Today's conversation, titled Colonialism, Hurricanes, and the U.S. Military, Civil Society to the Rescue in Vieques, Puerto Rico, is provided in recognition of National Hispanic Heritage Month. Mark, thank you for being here today.
Great, thank you, Logan. I'm going to take my jacket off. I remember this room being hot when I went to school here, and nothing has changed about it, which is awesome. Well, welcome everybody. So I'm going to be very frank about some statements and some things that I hope we'll have time to discuss afterwards. First of all, let me say I'm not the right person to be giving this presentation. I have very little standing to do so, and that's in comparison to others that are in the room. So what I'm talking about is my identity that I recognize and the privileges that I have. This is really important as I go through this presentation. I'm going to explain some of the elements of my identity. I'm white, I'm a male, I'm from New York State, which is important to understand, or just say New York, because that also is an identity issue that I've had to deal with in working in the Caribbean. And I certainly have other identities, but those are the ones that stand out. My privileges relate to those, certainly, but I also have the privilege of power, power of position, power related to those identities that I have. It's not necessarily power that I want to have in every instance, but I recognize that I have that. This is going to really be clear as I go through. I know a lot of you in the audience, but this leads to those previous comments. I want to recognize one person, Dr. Kyra Fuentes, who is here, who has way more standing than I do. So Kyra is from Puerto Rico. She's a close friend and colleague and has worked with me on Vieques and continues to work on Vieques. So I will be turning to Kyra a little bit as well. I expect another one of my colleagues and students to be here soon, also from San Juan. Are there any other Puerto Ricans here? Great, excellent. Puerto Rico stands for rich port, but that's a Spanish name that was given to. I'm going to call it a country, all right, because Puerto Ricans see it that way, but I'm going to clarify that in a minute. So excuse my pronunciation. One thing I have yet to do is really learn Spanish as much as I would like to, so Kyra tried to help me with this, but Boricua is a term that I think might be more appropriate. I'll ask Dr. Fuentes to correct me on that. Boricua is of indigenous origin. It was first used by a traveling companion of Columbus. Interesting that this week there was a day that we formally recognized as Columbus Day. But it is a Taino word, an indigenous word. More on this as we go on. So this is my story, which I do have standing to talk about. It's my perception through pictures and the voices of local people. You won't see, this has probably got the most words of any slide you're going to see in this presentation. It's a story of place and of people, and my objective is to leave you with that sense of place, but also a sense of what could be. This is a story of conflict, of hardship, of greed, of appropriation, of exploitation, of power, of justice or lack of, and sorrow. It's also, more importantly, a story of collaboration, art, the power of human spirit, of a new way, and of hope. It is, this should say military, by the way, so Logan, you're right, that's what it was. But it should say civil society and individuals to the rescue. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as well. The power of individuals. Colonialism versus colonialization. Don't know if people recognize the difference, but there is a difference. I chose that word, which means occupy or exploit. But I could have used colonialization as well, which is establishing control over indigenous people, appropriation for one's own use. And two apply, they both apply here. Another objective I have, as it was alluded to already, is in recognition of Hispanic Heritage Month. Interesting, because when we talk about the colonialization aspect of this, I'd like to go back and talk about that. But it's also the week of Indigenous Peoples Day, formerly known as Columbus Day for some of us. I'm going to try to weave these two things together today. Logan said this already, but I would like to read my own statement, recognizing the place in which we stand. I respectfully acknowledge that my employer, ESF, and my home in what is now called upstate New York resides on the territories of the Mohawk, Oneida, and Onondaga nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Further, my work in the Caribbean is done in full recognition of the original people of the Arawak, the Igneri, Saboni, and Taino, and the Carib Kalingago people of Central America. I owe great honor and extend deep gratitude to these original people and to the other animals, including people, plants, and other living organisms of these islands, these lands. So why Vieques? Why Vieques for me? It'll be self-evident through this presentation, so I'm not going to dive into it too deep here, but it's about the scale, it's about diversity, diversity of people, diversity of culture, diversity of ecosystems, of the unique challenges that it faces, of best practices, of it being on the front lines of climate change, being a canary in a coal mine. But the implication of all those words kind of does reek a little of appropriation. Like, what can we learn from Vieques? What can we get from Vieques? I did not say the word help. Why Vieques? To help. That is also appropriation, and in my opinion, somewhat discriminatory. It leaves the impression that they need to be helped. So let's talk about that later. I have to talk about white guilt. It's something I've struggled with, asking myself, why am I involved? So what is white guilt? A couple different ways to look at this. White guilt is bearing the collective responsibility for harm resulting from historic or current racial activities, racist activities, or a psychosocial consequence of racism along with empathy for victims. I can feel that, so I guess I have white guilt. But another aspect of white guilt is a form of self-congratulation where whites initiate compassionate policies towards people of color to showcase their innocence and separation from racism. Check a box. Feel good. Superficial. You can judge me based on what you hear. In my experiences in Puerto Rico and Vieques, I have seen both, and you're going to see some of both. I coined my own term. I think for me, this is also about man guilt. My identity. If you look at a lot of these challenges, I would fathom a guess or propose that it's mostly men behind it. Sorry for the men in the room, but you know what? That is a fact. So let's explore that a little bit. So I definitely have man guilt. So where is this? This is Vieques, 22 miles long, 3 miles wide, a little fuzzy, but kind of the best way to look at this. Very interesting, very arid on this end, which is the eastern end, and very lush on the western end. It's right here, Caribbean, right off the main island of Puerto Rico. Some people in the, if you want to resort back to the colonialism, call these the Spanish Virgin Islands. You don't hear it too much anymore because, again, the negative connotations. So another look at Vieques. I will go back to this image because there's some significance to the geography here of why some of the things have happened there. A beautiful place. Anybody been there? I know there's more people that have been there. Just absorb these for a minute. This is looking back towards the main island. This is El Yunque, the only rainforest in the states outside of Hawaii. This is Playa Negro. This is the black sand beach, magnetite. Magnetite, I think. Very unique. Vieques is known for its horses. This is the main street in one of the villages. The horses roam wild, but they're not wild. They're owned by somebody, and apparently, from what I've been told, they know where they are all the time. I don't know if I can believe that or not, but. Bioluminescence Bay, one of the key features on Vieques, largely considered to be the brightest bioluminescence bay in the world, mainly because of this small channel. The organisms don't usually get flushed out into the ocean. Very unique place. We have some students here in the room who have helped work on issues relating to the chemistry of that bay. But I haven't shown you the most important thing about Vieques yet. The people. The children. This little girl is looking at a composting worm, Kyra, that we showing composting. I just love that photo. Some of the ESF students asked me over that. This is very soon after Maria hit the island. It's also a place of some really awesome civil society organizations. This is the Vieques Conservation and Historic Trust. We'll talk more about them. Small place, powerful place. They also now control this piece of property, which is in the middle of the island, an old school that's been given to them. This is being turned into an environmental research field station, training location. Keep that in the back of your minds too. I think there's an opportunity now, certainly for ESF, but also for the Maxwell School here. I asked Kyra's permission before, but Kyra, would you mind translating that for us? You have to try to speak up.
So it says, Vieques stand up. Vieques se levanta.
So like stand strong. This is after Maria. The ceiba tree. Powerful. On some maps, this is the southern tip of the Bermuda Triangle. If you believe in things like this, very energetically powerful place. I certainly believe it. More than 300 years old, one of the largest in the world, sacred for the Taino, and very much protected. Got a little haircut after Maria, but still was standing. It's gone through Hugo, storms for centuries. Our first trip with students, you can see it's kind of coming back. We were there in May. It doesn't look good, but that's normal. This is apparently when it sheds its leaves when we were there, so that's all good. Don't have to worry about it. But just get a scope of the size here and the power. That's how big it is. So the ceiba tree is to me, represents a lot of what I'm going to be talking about here. Kyra helped me understand this as well. the way we use this term is very negative, particularly in the context of Puerto Rico. New York Times just came out with an article on this, an opinion piece. Why must Puerto Ricans always be resilient? When much of what's happening to them in regards to these challenges doesn't have anything to do with the decisions they've made. But yet, there needs to be resilience there. So I want to explore this concept with you more as we go through this. For instance, let me give you one example. Yarmar O'Neill from the Center for Puerto Rico Studies at Hunter College just wrote a piece about this as well, and he talked about it in the sense that emergency management, like our Federal Emergency Management Agency, has not adapted to climate change. So what do? We build back exactly the way it was before, and then another hurricane hits and destroys everything, and then it's the Puerto Ricans who did something wrong. The Utuado Bridge. We had a bunch of students go down and build this bridge in the middle of the island. It was an awesome thing in Mexico State University. Completely destroyed by Fiona. Completely gone. Again, built according to standards that existed before. The Jones Act. I'm not going to get into this a lot today, but if you're interested in this, look into the Jones Act. The Jones Act requires our territories to use U.S. flagged ships to bring goods into their communities. Because of that, there's very little competition, and because of that, the prices are extremely high. So there's huge limitations put on by the federal government. There are benefits to the Jones Act. It was put in place for some good reasons, but it has turned out to be a major impediment to what we see in Puerto Rico as it not being resilient. We have a president of a local college, Abadan Rodriguez in the University of Albany, who is from Mayaguez, Puerto Rico. He talks about it in the sense of human suffering is a consequence of mortality, illness, destruction of property, and further impoverishment resulting from these events. He says that these things will ripple well into the future. Again, based on we keep designing and building back the way it was before. So, colonialism. You can't read this, but this is in the Vieques community. It goes back to when the original peoples were there and the dates. Columbus arrives in Puerto Rico, Vieques, free. I love that they put that, free. It doesn't say he found Puerto Rico, because clearly the original people did. Talks about the Spanish domination, the Europeans that came and cut all the trees off. Sugar became a dominant economy. The emancipation of slaves. Slaves were used to operate the sugar plantations. Navy, U.S. Navy appropriates 2/3 of the island in 1941. I'm going to talk about that in a second. Hugo hits. David Saines is killed by a bomb by the U.S. Navy. This is when demonstrations started in 2003. In 2003, the Navy leaves. Hurricanes, Maria and Fiona, just the most recent. Why was the U.S. Navy there and the U.S. military there? A couple of different reasons. So now this is looking at a different perspective. Here is the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, main island, Vieques is right over here, Virgin Islands over here. So the deepest trench in the Atlantic is right here, Puerto Rico Trench. And then there's this other trench, the Anegada Trough, that goes through towards Vieques. This is where the USSR and USA played cat and mouse with submarines, and a lot of espionage happened here. So a very strategic place. Also, there was a naval base right on the end of the main island of Puerto Rico, which I'll show you right now. But because of the location, it still is a critical area for us. This is surveillance radar on Vieques, and that is for drug interdiction, to attempt to stop the flow of drugs through Vieques and the Caribbean. So when there's more pressure in Central America, drug runners use this area. So it's still very strategic from a homeland security standpoint. But back to this map. Why the Navy? Why the U.S. military? Because of these beaches. All of these areas replicate or are very similar to beaches in the Pacific Ocean. The Navy came in here in 1941. What was 1941? The start of World War II for us. Recognizing we were going to be fighting in the Pacific, they needed a place close to home to do their military training. So they basically used this part of the island for the bombing, and this part of the island for storage of spent ammunition, Agent Orange, and kept the population areas here in the middle. All of the people that were here were removed, forcibly removed from the island, and given postage stamp sized pieces of property on the main island of Puerto Rico. These are farmers that are used to farming, but not on a piece of land maybe a quarter of the size of this room, no kidding. Roosevelt Roads Naval Station was one of the largest naval stations that we had in this region. This is where the Atlantic Fleet was stationed. That's Vieques in the distance, so you can see how convenient this was for the Navy. Also, a very large runway. Incidentally, this runway was long enough for the space shuttle. If there was an incident with the space shuttle, it could land here. And also another interesting story, back during the Cuban Missile Crisis, people thought the UK would be very vulnerable to the USSR. This is where the United Kingdom government was going to be relocated, here. So we used it for everything. My son-in-law's grandfather was actually one of the people who was doing this, so it was very interesting to talk to somebody on the other side and their perspective. So they're coming to shore. There was an individual killed, I mentioned, but also one of these bombs also almost destroyed an elementary school in the middle of the island. So, again, there's David Saines, the individual that was killed because of an errant bomb. This is the entrance to where the Navy used to be. So this started in 1999 through 2003, a big effort. The Vieques, that's the locals, it's the name of the locals, climbed the Statue of Liberty and hung the municipal flag off the spire. This was a major embarrassment to our country, to the United States. Oh, and by the way, I said I would go back to that. Puerto Rico is part of the United States. It's amazing how many people don't realize that. However, and I won't use the person's name, I can't believe even to this day that this happened. One of our students was told by a faculty member after she gave a presentation, Puerto Rican student, I don't know what to do about the fact that you don't have an American accent. Think about that for a minute. Sorry to say, but if you really want to talk about America, including South America, I would say the Spanish accent is probably more prevalent. But it still exists today. I think this picture of the boy throwing a rock at the fence is just very powerful. A colleague of mine and I met this woman, I can't remember her name. She had chained herself to that fence while the bombing was going on. How did it stop? Bobby Kennedy got arrested for protesting, Reverend Al Sharpton. Base closing during President Clinton's era, that eventually resulted in the closing of the Roosevelt Roads Naval Station because bases were being closed all over the country. But it was this guy who ended up stopping it because of this guy. You might not know who this is. This was the governor of New York State at the time, George Pataki. And anybody in politics in New York knows that you need the Puerto Rican vote in New York City. So he learned about the bombing, a white paper was developed. He basically told him, if you want me to be elected for a second term, you will finalize the removal of the Navy. That's what eventually ended it. So as I said, this area was used, it's being cleaned up since they've moved out in 2003. It's a 20-year, 30-year process, more than that probably. And this area is really bad because there was a lot of stuff stored, as I said, like Agent Orange. But they used every kind of ammunition here that you can imagine. CNN did a big thing on it. You'll see the signage like some of our students saw. No trespassing, danger, explosives. When you start to get off the beaten track, The cleanup is resulting in this, all these bombs that were unexploded, those that have been diffused, or even out into the coral reefs, that's a bomb. So sailboats and stuff that come and throw their anchors out and hook into something like this is a big problem. So Logan mentioned the task force on Puerto Rico that was formed under President Clinton, and it was only to deal with one issue related to Puerto Rico, and that's the statehood issue. Second President Bush kept it, and then President Obama kept it, but he added one additional task, and that was the creation of this Vieques Sustainability Task Force as part of the White House Task Force, to once and for all deal with what he called the Vieques issue. That is basically the cleanup. Basically in Vieques, you'll see, if you read this report, you'll see there's issues with crime. The graduation rate is deplorable from the high school. The unemployment rate is the highest that you can imagine. There's no health care. The ferry, the only transportation back and forth affordable, used to work like just some of the time. It's better now. All of those things were the Vieques issue. So the task force was formed. But where does it hold its meetings? Not in Vieques, but in San Juan, or even Washington. So I think about that in my own hometown. If somebody's going to talk about my hometown and want me to be involved, and they have their meetings in New York City, that is a real slap in the face. So you see it. I give Judith Ank credit. She was the regional administrator for EPA. She's the one who really tried to move this forward. But even take a look at this guy here. He is representing the Puerto Rican government. So this task force was co-chaired by Judith and the governor's office of Puerto Rico. He's representing the governor. I watched him the whole meeting, and the whole time he was working on his phone, not listening to a thing that was said. We paid for these two individuals to come over from Vieques because it was deplorable that this group of agency leaders from the federal and territorial government were going to be talking about the fate of their island without people there. I mean, just look at his face. Bruda. He eventually spoke up. I mean, pretty loudly, and was heard. Well, here we are in Washington now. I mean, you just look at this. There were no Vieques here, except for maybe one or two. This is a Department of State official running the meeting. Department of State. That's an agency that deals with other countries, not our country. I couldn't believe this meeting. I walked out of this meeting talking about Vieques and what to do about Vieques. We finally convinced everybody to hold the meetings on Vieques. And here we are. We're now taking control. I'm trying to help facilitate. I'm starting to facilitate these with some colleagues. Kyra was there as well. And it looks great. Discussions, collaboration, trying to come up with solutions for all those problems. Here's our second meeting. The first meeting, we couldn't even get the mayor to show up, the local mayor. So now you've got Judith, a new governor's representative, and the mayor with his arms folded in front of him. He speaks English, but he refuses to speak English, and I can understand why. And he kept saying, this is BS, nothing is going to come of it. This is a waste of time. I didn't believe him at first. You know, it looks good. It looks like there's a lot of really cool stuff going on. You've all probably been in meetings like that. Here's our third meeting. A colleague and I facilitating. The mayor was sitting right there, and before this meeting started, there was a ribbon cutting for a new road on the other side of the island, and everybody got invited to this ribbon cutting except for the mayor. And he waited and waited. The meeting was 2 hours late to start. And one of these officials, this guy right here, is an assistant attorney general for the United States. So the attorney general's office was represented like third highest ranking official. He didn't go to the ribbon cutting. He was standing in the back, and I didn't go to the ribbon cutting either. I saw what was happening. And I said, you really need to go talk to the mayor because he's going to explode here any second. And he didn't go talk to him, and the mayor stormed out of the meeting before the meeting started. So now we've got the meeting going, trying to move things forward. What do you think happened with the Vieques Sustainability Task Force? And the great report that I showed you, and all the other reports. What do you think happened? Nothing. The pendulum of government and policy shifts, and a new administration comes into Washington. Nothing. I think about all the time invested in all the people. So civil society, the role of civil society leading into it. Oh, and I wanted to mention, this is also colonialism, in my opinion, that continues. This is an example of colonialism that continues. Right? So then the hurricanes. So you add insult to injury. We've all seen pictures of destruction, so I'm not going to dwell on it, but some of those beautiful areas I showed you are these same areas. It was like a bomb went off, and bombs have gone off there. My friend lived in this trailer. Vieques was out of communication, out of water. It was the forgotten island. They resorted to different ways to communicate. This is how they communicated. No cell service, no phones, you can't read this, but 2 pieces of plywood, people writing on it. What were they writing? Hang tough, we can make it. Looking for therapists for help. Please give us a shout out. We need help. Satellite phones are available for 1 minute allowance. 1 minute you could get a satellite phone to use in the trust. Or even more sad, any news Jen and Scott are missing, they were sailing. Imagine this is where you're trying to find your people. So civil society started to step up. Individuals started to step up. This is Mark Martin. We'll talk more about Mark. He's with the Conservation and Historic Trust. Where was that mayor during all this? I guess I understand his frustration, but honestly, he was sitting in a bar with no power. Kyra Wright, we know that. So this individual just stepped up and became kind of the de facto mayor of the island and saved lives. 2 other individuals. Mike from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So when the lands are cleaned up by the Navy, they're turned over to the Fish and Wildlife Service, which I think is really good. That is a good model. And then they make them available to the public for recreation. Mike is a local Puerto Rican guy who runs the Fish and Wildlife there, and he stepped up during this period in many ways to help. Alexei, Coast Guard, U.S. Coast Guard, stationed in San Juan, the Big Island, realizes that his island, nobody's paying attention to. 2 weeks after the storm, no water. The U.S. Navy is nowhere to be found. He convinces his commander to redirect a Coast Guard cutter that has a bunch of water in it to Vieques, and they come ashore on these dinghies holding water, and Mark was telling me how, just people cried. They had no authority to do that. They had no permission from Washington to do that. They could be court-martialed for that. But it takes individuals like Alexei. So I want to run something here quick if I can. I got a couple of audio clips. I might cut this one short, but while I was there in November, after telling you all this stuff, the lieutenant governor shows up to give away washing machines. They have no water. They have no power. So they have a big... I just want you to get a feel for this. I was appalled. Here's the mayor. All of a sudden, he's around. A lot of the people were actually from the main island and not from Vieques. But again, trying to instill spirit, hope, you get that. Kyra, I don't know if you recognize him. 3 local TV personalities from San Juan. All to promote the lieutenant governor giving away some washing machines. You get the gist. But just across the street were these individuals watching all that. Finally getting water from the government. Again, their faces tell a story here. And when that whole shindig was over, they all left. And the Vieques were left there. gave the little kids fire people's hats. Children grow up in these areas fearing the rain. Fearing the rain. When we were there was a line when we went down with students together to get gifts during the holy period. Toys. While I was there in November, 2 months after the hurricanes, this is FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Authority, disaster assistance. The gates were locked the whole time. You couldn't access it. Civil society came to the rescue. Humanity First, Hope Builders, she helped build houses. World Central Kitchen brought food. Tia Cove, a local nonprofit that helps protect the turtles, stepped up big time. AmeriCares brought doctors and nurses in. And All Hands and Hearts didn't necessarily work in Vieques, but was a key to Puerto Rican response. The Vieques Trust I keep referencing, in that school I mentioned, it's now a place where they're trying to reestablish mangroves. If you look at all the partners there, there is not one government agency funding this effort. It's all civil society. What is civil society? The aggregate of non-governmental organizations and institutions that manifest interest and the will of the citizens, or individuals and organizations in a society which are independent of the government. This is who stepped up there. So I was appalled after that. I was invited to give testimony at Congress to prove I was there. I did a little selfie. So before me were the three representatives of main agencies that were responsible for the response, including the regional EPA director at the time, which is good. He's a good guy. But they gave a bunch of, again, BS. And when they left, the room emptied. When the local people got up to speak and when I got up to speak. So there was really nobody there to hear. Then New York State got involved. New York State stands with Puerto Rico. This is a sign that says Governor Andrew Cuomo. He showed up a little while later. Fortunately, I was part of this, but we were skeptical. We were skeptical. I'm not going to run the audio on her, but I want to just show you this individual whose house was destroyed. She watched the FEMA officials and the Corps of Engineers officials walk up her street, and she pleaded with them to come in, and they wouldn't. And she was devastated until All Hands and Hearts showed up. Nonprofit, rebuilt her house. She lost everything. Everything was gone, sucked out of her house. But her story was heart-wrenching, but yet it ended in a very positive, because they literally were on the heels of FEMA and came in. Back to New York State, we were the first ship in the harbor after Maria. Not the Navy, not the federal government. It was the Empire State, which is a ship owned by SUNY Maritime College in the Bronx, filled with supplies. We came back in May with students, so this would have been, the first time it was there was in October of 2017. We came back in May of 2018 with students to help do service. And here we are coming on. And we were welcomed with open arms. Here's some of our students below. We came back in January of 2019, invited, and then in May of this year, invited. And we did a lot while we were there, but we also learned from a local Taino chief who happens to be the chair of their legislature about colonialism and about the role of the indigenous people. For instance, there was a 4,000-year-old skeleton found in Puerto Rico. This is how back civilization goes. We met a local woman, another member of civil society, Ardell, and her vision to build a park around that ceiba tree, a park that all could enjoy, and to preserve like 9 species of endangered species in the nearshore area. We saw her again this May. She is okay with me saying this, but she's suffering from cancer. Cancer is very high on Vieques, or has been, particularly for older people. you can maybe understand why. But again, her vision. But we took this serious. We've got Savannah here, who'd raise your hand. And we are working with her. This is an old diagram, Savannah, I know this isn't the most recent one. But to start to re-envision what this area around, let's say, the tree might look like and how it could be available for access. There's Ardell when we were there in May with our landscape architect students and faculty member. We were there, we played volleyball with the local girls team when we were there the first time. And I want to just play this for you. We're here because you are beautiful people. And we came here to learn from you and the beautiful place that you live in. And we are so fortunate that we have been engaging with you. And we're going to go home better people because of it.
Nosotros venimos aquí porque esta gente bien bonita, escogemos un lugar donde queríamos venir y aprender que vamos a ir a la casa.
So I asked some of our students if they would speak, and Em, who came out of her shell on this trip in an amazing way, was very reticent, and then all of a sudden she just jumped up. And this is not translated for you, but I think you're going to understand what she told them. Remember, we were trying to give hope, and these are young girls who never saw a life after Vieques. Can't even give birth on Vieques because there's no facilities.
De los 2 lados, de los 3 lados, de los 4 lados, ustedes enseñaron al mundo cómo es ser unificado y fuerte. Eso es que yo vi. Y gracias.
She was probably saying that they're strong, be stronger again. This one will be hard to hear, but you really need to hear Myrna, 90-something years old.
I am grateful for the opportunity to contribute to your knowledge of the Vieques situation, one where military exercises and experimentation with non-conventional weapons for more than 6 decades created a legacy of contamination that affects us to this day. 4 generations of Vieques citizens have suffered from the toxics that rained upon them in the shape of bombs and rockets, uranium, Agent Orange, napalm, and toxic metals, poisoning the air we breathe, our coastal waters, where we fish and swim, and the land that once fed our people. The 1/3 of our paradise, where our people were sandwiched between the areas for military games and ammunition storage, still houses the civilian population of second-class American citizens.
Second class.
There are less than 9,000 of us now. I'm dating this because I believe that now there are less than 7,000 of us. Our population is dwindling quickly.
Myrna goes on for a little while. What she was reading from was a cover memo for a bill that she was hoping would be introduced into the U.S. Congress, and it didn't get out of committee. She was asking for resources to once and for all deal with the decades-long of atrocious behavior there, and it never got out of committee. Her two grandchildren showed up. This is all of our students sitting around the table, some of which are in the room. And that is the same guy, remember, that I brought to Puerto Rico, who sat in that room and finally spoke up to be heard. And that's his sister. Again, she also chained herself to a fence during the bombing. So we're driving down the road, and who do we see on the side of the road? Day later, Myrna. What is this?
Vieques lives are valued.
So it's the hospital that has been defunct since 2016, even before the hurricane. This thing, all the years I went there before the hurricane, that light pole was that angle. And the reason that she's here is because the territorial government finally shows up and decides they're going to build a new hospital. And they've planed a whole bunch of people in, all these suits from San Juan. You can't see them, they're up there on a hill, gated, nobody can get in. It's all people from the main island to celebrate the fact that these demo pieces of equipment are taking down the hospital to finally build a new hospital. Do you think the new hospital is being built right now? No. And after this photo op, they all flew away. So the last civil society example I want to give you is Vieques Love. I've talked about it a couple of times. I'm the treasurer of the organization. Vieques Love was formed as a GoFundMe group right after Hurricane Maria and immediately developed a huge amount of money. And it is the #1 civil society example or entity on the island that is creating hope. And I want Mark to explain it to you. So he is now translating the previous director of the hospital, who tried for years to get them to replace the hospital. So she had just got done speaking to a group of people, and Mark will explain the role of Vieques Love quickly.
Because during the process of Maria, if it wasn't for Vieques Love, the health of this community would have been in serious trouble and chaos. It was a time where I was the medical director of the hospital, a post that she doesn't hold anymore, so she feels free to be able to say that the municipality didn't help her, the government didn't help her, that the only people that came to help her were Vieques Love, starting with Mark, that came, the first one who came to offer help, and that because of Vieques Love, and that was the only source of supplies, medicines, equipment, and help that they could have. And that she has said that to everybody that she has encountered, that she had extreme thanks for Vieques Love and the way they helped them. Gracias a ti.
So after Fiona, the 2 generators that power the whole island, because there's no power in Vieques, there was no diesel fuel for them. Nobody had bothered to stockpile diesel fuel. So again, Vieques Love was able to get diesel fuel to those generators to get power to Vieques. I think it was one of the first municipalities in the whole Puerto Rican community that actually had power. So we, since Maria, have become organized. We have been effective with social media. Mark is the face and the voice. Instagram, Facebook. He was giving reports real time when the hurricane was coming ashore. I don't want to show that to you right now. You can go there and look at it. But just because people on the island were able to access some of this as long as there was power and cell service. What are some future challenges here? I'm going to end here with just a couple slides. This is El Bloc. This is one of the tallest buildings on Vieques. Real controversial when it went in, hotel. Built right on top of a stream, which for those of us involved in the environment know how bad that is. So a real eyesore. Through Hurricane Maria, it withstood the hurricane and became the center of operations for the emergency response. But it is a bellwether. Is it something to harbinger of what might come? Gentrification. Because Vieques, the downside, I mean, the upside, I guess, if there's an upside, the fact that it was used as a military training ground is no developers looked at the island, while other Caribbean islands are massively being developed. Paradise. But there have been some gentrification examples. The Bachelor film there a couple of years ago, you see these big, huge villas, they're popping up all over the place, pushing the local people out, as Myrna said. The W Resort, this is like 2016, starts at $600 a night for a room on an island that's impoverished. By the way, the W was completely destroyed by the hurricane. There's great interest. There are no cruise ships coming to the island now, but there's great interest because of the beauty of the island. Take a look at the size of that thing. There's interest in bringing those in. The infrastructure on Vieques will not withstand this. The seagrass beds between Vieques and the main island of Puerto Rico, where I showed you the Roosevelt Road, are some of those productive seabeds from an ecosystem standpoint. In the Caribbean, that's where the cruise ships would come. Do we want it to look like Cancun or St. Thomas or Myrtle Beach? Because that's what could happen. So when President Trump came in, I told you about the U.S. Fish and Wildlife model, which is a really good model. EPA, Navy cleans up the lands, gets turned over to Fish and Wildlife. President Trump was starting to shop around selling those lands to developers. So we ended our last trip there with a circle with all of our students and the locals. We all told our story of why it was important that we were there. And I would love to share some of these stories with you at some point, but I think one of the most powerful was from one of the youngsters who said that she met a new lifelong friend of one of our students. Again, the impact that our part of civil society had on this. And our students are sticking with it. So we've created this new format organizational structure that we're trying to put together for our college on how we can better support Vieques, again, invited to do so. So we continue to move forward. I just want to throw a couple of really kind of fun or upbeat photos at the end here. Even the cats, we're glad we were there. This is a stray cat. This is one of our students. PTSD is prevalent, and it's prevalent in the animals as well. Very impactful to me. This is one of our students, Lindsay. She does not know Spanish. She does not know English. She does not know English. But the communication that was going on at that volleyball game that night, and the hope I saw in the eyes of the youth, look at her, she's playing with her hair. You can't, just can't quantify that. Kyra, I hope this doesn't embarrass you. That was during one of our trips there. Can you talk about what that is? That's a really important cultural thing. Sorry, I didn't warn you that was coming.
So that's the dance and music of bomba. Is one of the legacies from the enslaved people at Western Puerto Rico. And you have the people in the barrels, and then you have the dancer, in that case, me. So each time I do a stroke with my dress, that will signal the drummer and he will play. So in this case, the dancer became a musician by showing the rhythm that the drummer is playing, and have a strong significance because it was tried to, that music and culture was tried, they tried, when I say they, I mean the Spanish, US, to erase that music and that culture, because that is always part of the resistance of culture and the people.
Thank you, Kyra. Thank you for doing that. I also wanted to show you that Myrna sang to us. I'm not going to do the whole thing, but beautiful voice. Beautiful place. And it is rising. So with that, I'll end. We have just a few minutes, and we'll see if anybody has any questions.
Yeah, we got about 5 minutes for questions.
I have to say, I personally think that the role of civil society in this is the absolute way to go for communities. I am done with government. I know there's a role for government, but especially in Maxwell School where you study government. Nothing? No comments?
Maybe you want to talk about the future of ISO and ESF's involvement?
Right, so we've got, we got some projects we're working on, like the Save a Tree project and recycling, helping with asset mapping, but also our landscape architecture department wants to play a larger role there and create opportunities for students, but also for opportunities for Vieques, again, so that they have hope that they can see a future. So ESF has thrown itself completely into this, and I would love to talk to people about it afterwards. already said that to the food.
Nothing much really, other than to just say thank you for this thing. I've been in Vieques a couple of times, and I've always had questions that I had nowhere to ask, including the ghastly disconnect between so much wealth that is being brought in.
The one percenters.
Yeah,
more or less.
and poverty that is all around, as you see on the streets, as you see everywhere you go to eat, you see the disconnect and the disparity. And I just want to say thank you for highlighting these things.
Kyra, do you think I did that justice? And I'm fine with you saying no, because do you think that was a reasonable representation of your?
It is, and you went very smooth into it because he's, and I appreciate that because it's very tragic. We don't want people to go out crying. So you mentioned cancer, radiation, many people dying. With the hospital, the government started to make noise about rebuilding because a young girl died because there was no hospital there. So they needed to a helicopter and all this stuff to take her to the mainland. So there's a lot of suffering and trauma in Vieques, but I think that the whole concept of civil society, community-based organization,
Which you studied as your
individuals,
doctorate.
they are key to keep to keep resistant and to keep adapting because it's a non-stop thing to do, mostly in the Caribbean.
Kyra would also prefer us to use the word resistance versus resiliency, and resistance in a good way. I've learned a lot from you on that, and I really appreciate that.
So I apologize if you said all this. I think the role of civil society is obviously really important. To maybe get to your point that civil society also can be activist and be putting pressure on, not just helping. So I guess my question, the United States government has a responsibility to fix this. I know they can't, but you know what I mean. They have a deep responsibility for what happened here. And it just always feels like they get let off the hook, partially by the Puerto Rican government itself, which is also pretty dysfunctional here. So how do you see, and maybe I'm just always optimistic here, but civil society itself, without advocating to those parties and building some sort of power and strength, is not going to be able to solve these incredibly deep issues, which are not the fault of the people who are here.
Right, and there's no easy answer to that. That's why this is a conundrum, and it continues to be. But let me also say that we all know how President Trump dealt with this and throwing the paper towels and everything. But there was a lot of response by others, academic institutions, NGOs, as I showed you. The interesting thing after Fiona, President Biden was very quick, declared an emergency declaration. There was literally no response from academia or NGOs after Fiona. There was a dearth of response. And that's noticeable as well. So even though the federal government made a good declaration, has done something, still has not stepped up. And you're right about the Puerto Rican government. It's more like it's a wicked pendulum that shifts there, and the politics of things. And just when you start to make progress, that goes away because there's new leadership that comes in. I do believe that it's activists and members of civil society that can influence that. And I believe that people like Dr. Fuentes need to run for office, for instance, down there.
Seriously.
Yeah, so.
And then last point on that, the DOD now has all these new environmental goals.
Right.
This ESG movement.
Right.
Is there an opportunity there for influence because of this theoretical emphasis on environmental sustainability?
I think there is, yeah. And I do promote working with the DOD. Another interesting thing on Vieques is the culprit is the Navy. Really, it was NATO. It was NATO. Navy was the instrument. But what's the number one employer on Vieques? The U.S. Navy for the cleanup. So they're in a quandary. When the Navy leaves and the cleanup is done, if there's nothing from a sustainable economic standpoint to step in, it's going to be a problem. So I know that wasn't directly what you were asking.
What about statehood?
Oh, now you're getting into it. That's a whole other 2-hour seminar.
I think that's going to be about our time.
I'll be available if anybody
Yeah,
wants to
if
chat.
anyone wants to linger for questions, we do have to return the equipment. At that time, there's another meeting coming to this room. But thank you so much for your interest. I know I have plenty of follow-up questions for Mark, and this has been great. And I want to remind everyone that this is the audio and visual is going to be uploaded to our website, and it's going to be made available as a link that you can freely share. And I hope that some of you are able to join us for our next Conversations in Conflict Studies series. We have a digital seminar coming up on the 27th, and our next in-person seminar will be held in a to-be-determined room on November 3rd. So, thank you all for coming, and
Thank you.
thank you.